This is the Tree of Life, Season 24, Chapter 9. In this episode, we will be talking about how sequential substitution events within hierarchical natural law act as social nodes. To start out, in the last episode, we talked about how the context length, that is the distance between any two dialectical impulses in an analog structure, in reverse substitution, is tied to hierarchical priority. To explain, those higher in the hierarchy are described by transitionary structures, in reverse substitution, which have a longer context length than those lower in the hierarchy. This means that the number of dialectical steps between the affirmational and negational impulse is greater as you rise in priority. While most lower in the hierarchy are restricted to a single dialectical step in degeneration, those higher in priority may approach two dialectical movements in degeneration, or higher than two. This has a couple of effects. First, it means that those higher in priority can form analog structures, describing conflicts amongst groups, or individuals' representations of what is true. That is, in a sequential substitution event for a higher in priority individual, preference shifting manifests as decision-making between two conflictual groups, or individuals. Thus, to reiterate, a digital structure at the beginning of a sequential substitution event, describing affirmation of set 1 and negation of set not 1, becomes an analog structure, with affirmation of set 2 and negation of set 1, before becoming affirmation of set 2 and negation of set not 2. The distance between impulse 1 and 2 in the analog structure is the context length. Thus, the decision-making is as much about shifting between impulse 1 and impulse 2, as it is about imposing a context length on the lower in priority by virtue of that shift in preference. Thus, sequential substitution events, preference shifting, forms at social nodes through hierarchical priority. The hierarchy preserves its priority by imposing a context length upon the lower in priority. These social nodes also join functionally independent hierarchies in private or public spaces. They do so by maintaining the context length. These social nodes also act to redirect the flow of consciousness from vessel to vessel by priority. They act as switches to the flow of consciousness by recapitulating priority within hierarchies. Now, in the tautological flow of consciousness from vessel to vessel, we see that both forms of substitution event reveal a property. In reverse substitution, we see that the flow of consciousness stems from an interruption between acquiescence and expression. In substitution events, we see infinite recursion flows from negation before acquiescence. Thus, tautological flow and infinite recursion are both products of the same property of consciousness, in that it tends to expand, continually flowing in one direction or another. Infinite recursion follows from the frustration of tautological flow by internal negation. Reverse substitution recapitulates tautological flow by the intervention of the incoming consciousness. In tautological flow, we see the expansion of the waveform, which is a class of subjects into the vessel. In infinite recursion, we see the expansion of the subject into infinite paths within a bubble universe. The boundary of this bubble universe is provided by the compelling of acquiescence in a substitution event following reverse substitution. Thus, we can see that just as hierarchical priority creates nodes, infinite recursion represents antinodes. These antinodes describe transitionary analog structures where the two-step rule applies. That is, the distance between the substitutionary or contextually dialectical sets in any analog structure is greater than two steps of dialectical degeneration. Now, experientially, it is not enough to merely negate two linear sequential impulses, for these would be distinct degenerations. What is necessary is for any single negated impulse, there be more than two steps for it to result in acquiescence. That's the end of the podcast for today.